The mud of Oakhaven didn't just coat your boots, it tried to swallow you whole. It was a thick, clay-heavy slurry, mixed with a darker, oily runoff from the coal mines that had long since stopped yielding anything but misery. Elara Vance stood ankle-deep in the center of the town square, the cold dampness seeping through the cracked leather of her worn boots, numbing her toes, but the cold in her feet was nothing compared to the burning heat that crawled up her neck and settled in her cheeks. She kept her eyes fixed on the dirty hem of her apron, refusing to look up at the faces she knew were staring. She took up space. She knew that. In a town where ribs showed through shirts like the rungs of a broken ladder, where children went to bed with bellies full of water to trick the hunger, Elara was an anomaly. She was soft where the world was hard, heavy where the world was light. Her uncle, Jedediah, held the rope that was loosely loop-knotted around her left wrist, not tight enough to chafe, but visible enough to strip away the last shred of her humanity. "Look at her." Jedediah's voice was high and reedy, cutting through the damp morning air like a rusted saw. He gestured to her, as if she were a prize heifer at a county fair, though his tone held no pride, only desperate bargaining. "She's sturdy, strong back, can cook a stew out of bark and boot leather if she has to, keeps a warm house." A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd gathered on the boardwalks. It was a cruel sound, sharp and jagged. "She'd eat the stew before it hit the bowl, Jed," a miner shouted from the porch of the saloon. He was leaning against a post, his face gray with coal dust and exhaustion. "I got 3 mouths to feed. I don't need a 4th that's the size of the other 3 combined." Elara shrank inward, hunching her shoulders, wishing she could fold herself into something small, something that could slip between the floorboards of the platform and disappear into the dark earth. She pulled her shawl tighter around her ample frame, but the wool was threadbare and offered little protection against the biting wind or the words that felt like stones. She was 24 years old, and she felt ancient. She had spent her life apologizing for her existence, for the space she occupied, for the appetite she tried to suppress, but which her body seemed to betray at every turn. "She's a burden, Jed, and we all know it," Mrs. Holloway called out, clutching her purse tight. "You been trying to marry her off since she turned 16. Ain't no man in Oakhaven got a bed frame strong enough." Elara closed her eyes. She focused on the smell of the air wood smoke, wet pine, and the underlying stench of unwashed bodies and desperation. She tried to float away from the platform, to be anywhere else. "Just let it end," she prayed silently. "Let someone buy me for a servant, or let Jedediah give up and take me back to the shack so I can scrub the floors until my fingers bleed. Just stop the talking." "I'm asking for $10, Jedediah shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. He yanked the rope slightly and Elara stumbled, her heavy weight shifting awkwardly in the mud. The crowd laughed again. "5. I'll take $5. That's less than a mule. She can sew, she can mend." "I'll give you a sack of rotten potatoes, and you keep the girl," someone heckled. The laughter was growing louder, a cacophony of mockery that rang in Elara's ears like a bell. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and humiliating. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the metallic tang of blood, forcing herself not to cry. Crying would only make her look weaker, softer. Then the laughter stopped. It didn't taper off, it was severed, instantly, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the world. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against Elara's eardrums. She felt the shift in the air before she saw the cause. The wind seemed to change direction, carrying with it a new scent, something wilder than the town. It smelled of deep, untouched snow, of iron and of old, cured blood. Slowly Elara lifted her head. The crowd had parted. Men who had been shouting insults seconds ago were now shrinking back against the walls, averting their eyes. Women pulled their children behind their skirts. Walking down the center of the muddy street was a nightmare made flesh. He was a giant of a man, easily a head taller than anyone else in Oakhaven. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a massive grizzly bear, the fur matted and thick, adding to his impossible breadth. Beneath the furs, he wore buckskins that were stained dark with grease and earth. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, and matted in places, hanging wild around a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in a storm. A jagged scar, thick and white, ran from his left temple, slicing through his eyebrow, missing the eye by a miracle, and carving a trench down his cheek into his beard. It twisted his face into a permanent grimace like snarl, though his eyes, pale, icy blue, were devoid of emotion. They were the eyes of a wolf looking at a rabbit. Silas Thorne, the savage. The stories about him were whispered to frighten children. They said he lived at the peak of Blackwood Mountain, where the air was too thin for normal men to breathe. They said he had found the mother lode, a vein of gold as thick as a man's thigh, but that he guarded it with traps that could snap a man in half. They said he had killed a man with his bare hands for trespassing, and that he preferred the company of beasts to humans. He didn't walk, he stalked. His boots, heavy and reinforced with iron, sank into the mud with a wet crunch, but his gait was steady, unyielding. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Jedediah. His eyes were locked on Elara. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt suddenly exposed, as if the threadbare shawl had vanished. He was looking at her, not at her face, but at the whole of her. His gaze swept over her wide hips, her thick waist, the heavy curve of her bosom, the fullness of her arms. Most men looked at her with disgust. Silas Thorne looked at her with assessment. It was a cold, terrifying calculation. He stopped at the edge of the wooden platform. The smell of him was overwhelming now, musk, pine resin, and the metallic scent of a rifle that had been fired recently. He carried a Winchester repeater in a scabbard on his back, and a knife the size of a short sword at his hip. Jedediah was trembling. The rope in his hand shook. "And Mr. Thorne," he stammered, his voice cracking, I didn't know you were coming down for supplies this month. We didn't save any flour." Silas didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge the apology. He just stood there, a dark monolith in the gray light, staring at Elara. Elara couldn't breathe. She felt like prey. She waited for the insult, for the monster to say what the townsfolk had been thinking, that she was too fat even to be a slave. Silas slowly raised a hand. It was massive, calloused, the knuckles scarred and rough. He pointed a finger at Elara. "Price," he rumbled. His voice was deep, a subterranean sound that vibrated in the wood of the platform beneath Elara's feet. It sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground. Jedediah blinked, stunned. "The girl? You want Elara?" "Price," Silas repeated. He didn't blink. I was asking $5, Jedediah said, greed instantly warring with his fear. "But for you, Mr. Thorne. She's a big eater, you know. Takes a lot to keep her going. Maybe $3? Silas reached into his belt. He didn't pull out a coin purse. He pulled out a heavy leather drawstring pouch. It was stained and worn. He weighed it in his hand for a moment, the contents shifting with a heavy sand-like sound. Then he dropped it. It hit the wooden planks at Jedediah's feet with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence. It didn't sound like coins. It sounded solid, heavy. "Gold dust," a miner whispered from the front row, his eyes widening. Silas reached into his belt again. He pulled out a second pouch, identical to the first. He dropped that one too. Thud. The town gasped. That was enough gold to buy the saloon. It was enough to buy Jedediah's shack 10 times over. It was a fortune. "Double," Silas said. The word hung in the air. Jedediah dropped the rope as if it were burning him. He fell to his knees, scrambling for the pouches, his fingers trembling as he clawed at the leather strings to peek inside. "Sold! She's yours! Take her! Take her!" Elara felt the world tilt. Sold. She had been sold to the monster of the mountain, the man who supposedly skinned men like deer. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. She stepped back, her heel catching on a warped plank. Silas stepped up onto the platform. The wood groaned under his weight. He towered over her, blotting out the gray sky. Up close, he was even more terrifying. The scars on his face were jagged ravines. His beard was a tangled thicket. He looked down at her. Elara braced herself. She waited for him to grab her by the hair, or to drag her by the wrist like Jedediah had. She waited for the cruelty that every man in this town had shown her. Instead, Silas Thorne did something that made the entire town of Oakhaven stop breathing. He took a step back. He placed his massive right hand over his heart, and slowly, stiffly, like a rusty hinge forced to move for the first time in years, he bowed. It wasn't a mocking bow. He bent at the waist, his head lowering in genuine courtly deference. It was the kind of bow a knight would offer a queen in the storybooks Elara used to read before her mother died. It was respectful. It was solemn. He held the position for a long beat, his dark hair falling forward to hide his scarred face. When he straightened, he didn't grab her. He extended his arm, palm open, waiting. Elara stared at his hand. It was dirty, scarred, and lethal, but it was open, and he was waiting for her to take it. Trembling, her breath catching in ragged gasps, Elara reached out. Her hand, plump and soft and pale, looked like a child's hand against his paw. As soon as her skin brushed his fingers closed around hers. He didn't squeeze, he didn't crush. His grip was firm, anchoring, enveloping her hand completely. His skin was rough like sandpaper, calloused and dry, but radiating a heat that was shocking in the cold air. "Come," he said. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. He led her off the platform. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, eyes wide with shock and confusion. They watched as the savage led the fat girl through the mud toward the livery post, where a massive black draft horse, a beast as gigantic as its master, was tethered. The horse snorted, stomping a hoof into the slush. It looked wild, its eyes rolling. Elara stopped. Panic flared again. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm too heavy. I'll break his back. I can't ride." Silas turned to her. For the first time, he looked her directly in the eyes. His blue eyes were intense, unreadable, but they weren't mocking. He looked at the horse, then back at her. "Warhorse," Silas grunted. "Carries elk, carries iron." He paused, his gaze dropping to her waist, then back to her face. "We'll carry you." He didn't wait for her to argue. He stepped in close. Elara flinched, expecting pain. Silas bent his knees and placed his hands on her waist. His hands were so large, they nearly spanned her sides. He felt the softness of her, the layers of flesh she hated, the corset straining against her ribs. He didn't grimace. He gripped her with the certainty of a man handling a precious sack of grain. With a grunt of exertion that came from his chest, he lifted her. Elara gasped, clutching at his bare fur shoulders. For a moment, she was weightless. The sensation was dizzying. No one had picked her up since she was 5 years old. He hoisted her high, his muscles bunching like steel cables beneath the buckskin, and deposited her sideways onto the saddle. The horse shifted its weight but didn't buckle. It stood firm. Silas adjusted her skirts with a surprising lack of awkwardness, ensuring her legs were covered against the cold. Then, he swung himself up behind her in one fluid motion. The saddle groaned but held. Suddenly, Elara was surrounded. Silas's chest was a wall of heat against her back. His arms came around her to grab the reins, effectively boxing her in. She was enveloped in the smell of him, the musk, the leather, the smoke. She could feel the steady, slow thud of his heart against her shoulder blade. He kicked the horse into a walk. "Wait!" Jedediah called out, clutching the gold pouches to his chest. "Mr. Thorne, what are you going to do with her?" Silas didn't turn around. He didn't look back at the town that was already fading into the mist. He urged the horse faster, the hooves throwing up clods of mud as they headed toward the dense, dark tree line of the mountain base. "Home," Silas said. The word was lost to the wind, heard only by Elara. As they crossed the threshold from the town to the forest, the canopy of trees swallowing them whole, Elara realized she wasn't just leaving Oakhaven. She was ascending into the sky, carried by a beast, toward a fate that terrified her more than the auction block ever could. The town disappeared. The silence of the mountain took over, and for the first time in her life the cold didn't reach her, blocked by the wall of fur and muscle at her back. The air grew thinner, sharpening in her lungs like swallowed glass, as the black draft horse climbed higher into the cloud line. The dense canopy of the lower forest, with its dripping oaks and tangles of ivy, slowly gave way to the ancient, brooding sentinels of the alpine ridge, massive Douglas firs and blue spruces that stabbed at the gray underbelly of the sky. Elara had lost feeling in her toes miles ago. The cold here wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical weight, pressing against her skin, seeking any weakness in her clothing. But the heat at her back remained constant. Silas Thorne sat behind her like a stone wall, his chest a furnace that radiated warmth through the layers of buckskin and wool. He didn't speak. He didn't adjust his grip. His arms, thick as tree limbs, held the reins with a loose competence, his body absorbing the jarring rhythm of the horse so that Elara wouldn't have to. She was terrified to move, terrified to lean back against him, yet she had no choice. Every time the horse navigated a steep switchback or stepped over a fallen log, gravity pulled her into him. She felt the hardness of his muscles, the unyielding solidness of a man carved from the mountain itself. He smelled of wood smoke that had settled deep into the fibers of his coat, and beneath that, the sharp copper scent of the wilderness. It was an intoxicating, frightening scent, the smell of a predator. They rode for what felt like hours, the silence between them louder than the wind whistling through the crags. Elara's mind raced with dark possibilities. Why did he pay double? The question gnawed at her. Men didn't pay double for workhorses unless they intended to work them to death. Was she to be a servant? Or something worse? The stories of mountain men were grim tales of madness, of women taken and never seen again, used until they broke. The horse crested a final rocky ridge, and the path leveled out onto a high plateau sheltered by a sheer granite cliff face. There, nestled against the rock like a barnacle clinging to a ship's hull, was the cabin. To call it a cabin was an insult. It was a fortress. It was built from logs so massive Elara couldn't wrap her arms around them, whole trunks of ancient cedar, peeled and notched with brutal precision. The roof was steep, designed to shed the heavy snows, and a chimney made of river stones chugged thick white smoke into the darkening sky. There were no delicate gardens, no picket fences, just a chopping block with an axe buried deep in the wood, a curing rack stretched with the hide of an elk, and a silence so profound it made her ears ring. Silas pulled on the reins, and the horse came to a huffing halt. The steam from the beast's nostrils rose like dragon's breath in the frigid air. Without a word, Silas swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The earth seemed to shudder when his boots hit. He reached up, his movements efficient and impersonal, and grasped Elara by the waist again. This time she tried to help, gripping his shoulders to brace herself, but her hand slipped on the sleek cold fur of his coat. He didn't falter. He lowered her slowly, not letting go until he was sure her boots had found purchase on the frozen mud. "Inside," he rumbled, pointing a gloved finger toward the heavy timber door. "Storm coming." Elara looked up at the sky. The gray had turned to a bruised purple, heavy and low. She hurried toward the door, her legs numb and wobbly after the long ride. She struggled with the iron latch. It was heavy, cold enough to burn her skin, until a large hand reached over her shoulder and thumbed it open with ease. Silas ushered her in, then turned back to lead the horse toward a lean-to stable attached to the side of the main structure. Elara stepped inside and stopped, a breath leaving her in a rush. The interior was vast, a single great room dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast a whole hog. The fire was banked low, a bed of glowing orange coals that cast long dancing shadows across the floorboards. The walls were lined with shelves packed with jars, tools, and neatly folded pelts. In the corner stood a bed frame made of raw timber, piled high with furs. Bear, wolf, beaver. It looked impossibly soft, a cloud anchored in the center of a cave. It was clean. That was the most shocking part. There was no filth, no rotting food. The floorboards were swept bare. It smelled of sage and cedar oil. It was a masculine space, utilitarian and sparse, but it held a strange, severe beauty. The door creaked open behind her, letting in a gust of freezing wind before Silas slammed it shut and dropped a heavy oak bar across it. The sound of the lock falling into place echoed like a gunshot. Elara flinched, turning to face him. He was stomping the snow off his boots, shaking the ice from his bare fur coat before hanging it on a peg. Without the bulk of the coat, he was still terrifyingly large. He wore a heavy flannel shirt that strained across his shoulders, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms roped with muscle and scarred from years of labor. He turned and looked at her. In the firelight, the scar on his face looked deeper, a crimson canyon dividing his features. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his blue eyes tracking the way her hands twisted nervously in her apron. Elara's voice came out as a squeak. She cleared her throat, trying to summon the dignity she had lost on the auction block. "I can work, Mr. Thorne. I know I'm slow, but I have strong hands. I can clean. I can cook. I see you have a skillet there." She took a step toward the iron stove in the kitchen area, desperate to prove she wasn't just a mouth to feed. She reached for a cast-iron pan hanging on a hook. "Leave it," Silas growled. Elara froze, her hand hovering inches from the handle. She pulled back as if burned. I'm sorry. I just wanted to—" "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a rough-hewn chair near the fire. Elara obeyed instantly, her heart thumping. She sat, the wood hard against her back. She watched as Silas moved through the room. For a man of his size, he moved with eerie silence, his footsteps barely registering on the wood. He went to the larder and pulled out a slab of smoked venison and a jar of preserved peaches. He sliced the meat with a knife from his belt, a blade that looked sharp enough to shave with, and arranged it on a tin plate. He walked over and placed the plate on her lap. The food smelled rich and smoky. Elara's stomach growled loudly, a treacherous sound in the quiet room. Shame flooded her face. She was the fat girl, the glutton, and here she was, stomach rumbling the moment she arrived. "Eat," Silas said. He turned away, walking to the other side of the room to stoke the fire. Aren't you eating?" Elara asked, staring at the generous portion. "Ate this morning," he muttered, not looking back. Elara picked up a piece of meat. It was salty and tough, but flavorful. She ate slowly, conscious of every bite, terrified he was counting the mouthfuls, judging her appetite. When she finished, the silence stretched out, thin and taut. The wind outside had picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, making the heavy logs groan. Silas stood up and walked to the massive bed. He stripped the top layer of furs back, revealing clean flannel sheets. He fluffed the pillows, large sacks filled with goose down. "Sleep," he said, pointing at the bed. Elara stared at him, her blood running cold. This is it, she thought. This is the payment. The bed was huge. He was huge. She looked down at her own body, hidden beneath layers of worn wool but undeniably large. The thought of him expecting her to perform wifely duties, the thought of exposing her soft, scarred, imperfect flesh to this hard, perfect predator made bile rise in her throat. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice trembling, Please, I can sleep on the floor. I don't mind, I'm used to it." Silas turned slowly, his brow furrowed, the scar crinkling. "Floor is cold. Drafts." "It's fine, truly," Elara insisted, clutching her shawl. I take up too much room. You need your rest. You paid for the house to be kept." Silas stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something like confusion. Then, understanding seemed to dawn on him, followed by a flash of something darker. He looked at the bed, then at her, then down at his own hands. He let out a short, harsh huff of breath through his nose. "Bed is yours," he said, his voice flat, final. "I sleep by the fire." He didn't wait for an argument. He grabbed a single buffalo hide and a wool blanket from a chest, threw them onto the rug in front of the hearth, and sat down with his back to her. Elara sat frozen in the chair. He was rejecting her. Of course he was. He had bought a servant, not a woman. He couldn't bring himself to share a bed with someone like her. The relief was overwhelming. But beneath it, a sharp, familiar sting of rejection pierced her heart. Too fat for a husband, the town had said. Too fat, even for the savage her mind supplied. "Go," he said to the fire, not turning around. "Light goes out soon." Elara scrambled up, her movements clumsy. She went to the bed. It was high. She had to hop slightly to get onto the mattress. She didn't undress. She felt safer in her clothes, armor against the world. She crawled under the heavy furs, pulling them up to her chin. The mattress sank under her weight, but it didn't creak. It held her. It was the softest thing she had ever felt. Silas stood up and walked to the oil lamp hanging from the central beam. He blew it out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the orange glow of the embers. Elara lay in the dark, listening to the storm ramp up outside. Snow lashed against the small window panes like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of wood and the rhythmic breathing of the man on the floor. She rolled onto her side, facing the wall, tears finally leaking from her eyes to wet the flannel pillowcase. She was warm, she was full, and she was safe from the wind. But the distance between the bed and the hearth felt like an ocean. On the floor, Silas Thorne lay awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. He could hear her muffled sniffles. His hand clenched into a fist, the leather of his glove creaking. He wanted to tell her that the bed was too soft for him, that the floor helped his back. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't rejecting her, but that he was afraid if he lay next to her, the dirt and blood of his life would stain her. He was a creature of sharp edges and violence. She was soft, clean, alive. He brought his hand up to his face, tracing the thick raised keloid of his scar. Beast, he thought. Let her sleep. Tomorrow she sees the monster in the light. Outside, the wind screamed, burying the cabin in white, sealing them in together. The first heavy snow of the season had begun, and with it, the trap was set. They were alone, and the cabin felt smaller by the second. The darkness didn't lift with the dawn. It merely shifted from black to a suffocating milky gray. The storm had buried the cabin. Snow was banked high against the windows, blotting out the world, turning the interior into a dim, timeless cave. The wind had ceased its screaming, replaced by a heavy, muffling silence that pressed against Elara's ears like cotton wool. She woke with a start, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. The fire was dead. Panic spiked in her chest. The cabin was an icebox. She sat up, clutching the furs to her chest, her eyes darting to the hearth. Silas was a mountain man, a creature of survival. He wouldn't let the fire die. He wouldn't let the cold in. "Mr. Thorne?" she whispered. There was no answer, just the sound of ragged, wet breathing from the floor. Elara threw off the covers. The cold hit her like a physical blow, biting through her flannel nightdress, turning her skin to gooseflesh instantly. She hurried across the floorboards, the wood biting into her bare feet. Silas was where he had lain the night before, but he was no longer the stoic statue. He was thrashing slightly, his legs kicking out against the buffalo hide, his head tossing from side to side. Elara dropped to her knees beside him. "Mr. Thorne?" She reached out to touch his shoulder, and the heat radiating from him shocked her. He was burning up. His skin was dry and papery, flushed a dark, angry red beneath the beard and the grime. "No, not the trap," he mumbled, his voice a gravelly rasp, thick with delirium. He flinched away from her hand, his eyes squeezing shut. Elara's heart hammered. She looked at him, really, looked at him, and saw what the shadows had hidden the night before. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and beneath the fabric near his ribs, she saw the angry purple lines of infection tracking up from a jagged, poorly healed wound. It looked like claw marks, old but aggravated. The ride in the freezing rain, the way he had given her his coat, the exhaustion, it had all culminated in this. The mountain had finally found a chink in the bear's armor. "You're burning," she whispered, terror gripping her. If he died, she died. It was that simple. She couldn't survive here alone. But looking at his pained face, the fear for herself evaporated, replaced by a fierce maternal instinct she hadn't known she possessed. She needed to get him warm, not fever hot but core warm. The floor was freezing, sapping the life out of him from below. "I need to move you," she said, more to herself than him. She grabbed his arm. It was like grabbing a tree branch. She pulled, gritting her teeth. He didn't budge. He was over 250 pounds of dense bone and muscle. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. Mrs. Halloway had called her a beast of burden. Well, now she had to be one. Elara planted her feet wide on the rug. She didn't have delicate bird-like limbs. She had thick, sturdy legs. She had a broad back. She had weight. For the first time in her life, she didn't hate her size. She used it. She hooked her arms under his armpits, bracing her chest against his head. "Come on, Silas," she grunted. "Help me." She leaned back, using her mass as a counterweight. Her boot slipped, then caught. With a cry of exertion that tore at her throat, she dragged him. Inch by agonizing inch, she pulled his dead weight across the floor, closer to the hearth, onto the thickest pile of furs. She collapsed back, gasping, sweat pricking her hairline despite the freezing room. Her arms trembled. But there was no time to rest. She scrambled to the woodpile. Her hands, usually so careful with needle and thread, were clumsy as she smashed kindling, arranging it with shaking fingers. She struck the flint, praying, until a spark caught the dry moss. She blew on it gently, coaxing the flame to life until it roared, hungry and bright, pushing the shadows back. Silas groaned, his teeth chattering now. The fever chills had set in. He was shaking so violently his boots drummed against the floor. "Cold," he gasped, his eyes flying open. They were glassy, seeing things that weren't there. Ice in the blood. "I know," Elara soothed, crawling back to him. "I'm here." She reached for the water bucket, but the surface was frozen solid. She grabbed the iron ladle and smashed the ice, scooping out jagged chunks and putting them into a pot on the stove to melt. She needed to get fluids into him, but first, she had to stop the shivering. She piled every blanket she could find on top of him, the furs from the bed, the wool throws from the chair. But he continued to shake, his body convulsing in rigorous spasms that looked painful enough to snap bone. It wasn't enough. The external heat wasn't reaching him fast enough. Elara stared at him, biting her lip. She knew what the old wives in Oakhaven did for hypothermia and fever chills. She knew the only heat that could penetrate this kind of cold was living heat. She hesitated only a second. Shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. Elara began to unbutton her dress. Her fingers felt thick and numb, but she worked quickly, stripping down to her chemise and bloomers. The air raised bumps on her pale skin, but she ignored it. She knelt beside Silas and began to work on his buttons. "No," he groaned, his hand batting weakly at hers. "Don't, unworthy." "Hush," she commanded softly. She peeled the sweat-soaked flannel from his chest. The sight of his torso made her breath hitch. He was a landscape of violence. Scars crisscrossed his chest and stomach, bullet wounds, knife slashes, and the terrible puckered claw marks on his side that were radiating heat and sickness. He wasn't beautiful in the way the town dandies were. He was beautiful like a ruined castle. Is beautiful enduring, tragic, and imposing. She tossed his wet shirt aside. Then, taking a deep breath, Elara climbed under the mountain of furs. She pressed her body against his. The contact was shocking. He was scorching hot, yet his skin felt like ice. Elara wrapped her arms around his broad torso, pulling him as close as she could. She pressed her softness against his hardness, her abundance against his depletion. She tangled her legs with his, maximizing the contact, forcing her own body heat to seep into him. "It's all right," she whispered into the hollow of his neck, her face buried in his beard. He smelled of salt and sickness now, but underneath, still that scent of pine and earth. "I've got you." Silas stiffened at first, his muscles locking up. He wasn't used to touch. He wasn't used to softness. In his delirium, he must have thought he was being attacked. But then, the shivering began to subside. The convulsion slowed to a tremble. He let out a long, ragged exhale and slumped against her. Elara held him. She stroked the hair back from his damp forehead, her fingers tracing the line of the scar that divided his face. Up close, it wasn't scary. It was just a line where the skin had knit itself back together, trying to heal, just like her heart was trying to do. Time lost its meaning. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound in the buried world. Elara lay there, acting as a human shield between Silas and the death that wanted to take him. After an hour, or maybe 3, Silas shifted. His breathing had deepened, the rasp lessening. The fever was breaking. She could feel the sweat slicking his skin, cooling rapidly. He turned his head. His nose brushed against her neck. "Elara?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but the delirium was gone. Elara pulled back slightly, looking into his face. His eyes were open, clear now, startlingly blue in the firelight. They were inches apart. She suddenly realized the impropriety of it. She was nearly naked, wrapped around a man who wasn't her husband, in a cabin miles from civilization. She started to scramble away. I'm sorry, I had to. You were shaking so bad, I didn't know what else." His arm moved, fast. His heavy hand clamped onto her waist, anchoring her in place. He didn't let her pull away. His grip was weak, but desperate. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't go, Bold." Elara froze. She looked down at his hand. It was spread wide over her ribs, his thumb resting on the soft curve of her belly. He wasn't recoiling. He was holding on. Silas looked up at her, his gaze traveling over her face, her neck, the swell of her bosom in the thin chemise. There was no calculation in his eyes now, no assessment of value. There was only hunger, not for food, but for comfort, for her. They said, he swallowed hard, his throat dry, they said you were too much. Elara flinched, looking down. I know. Fools, Silas whispered. The word was fierce. He moved his hand, sliding it up, her back, pulling her down until her forehead rested against his. Not too much. Enough. You are. Abundance. The word hung in the air, warm and golden. Abundance. Not fat, not heavy. Abundance. Like a harvest, like a river in spring. Tears sprang to Elara's eyes, hot and fast. She had waited 24 years to hear a man speak of her body without disdain, and it was this man, this broken, savage giant, who said it. You saved me, he murmured, his eyes closing again as exhaustion dragged him back down. My anchor. He adjusted his head, nuzzling into the crook of her shoulder, seeking her warmth like a child seeking a mother, like a lover seeking a partner. He let out a content sigh, the tension leaving his frame entirely. Stay, he breathed. I'm not going anywhere, Elara whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. She relaxed into him, her body molding against his. The shame that had followed her from Oakhaven, the voice that told her she was unlovable, grew quiet. In this cabin, buried under the snow, she wasn't the fat girl. She was the fire. She was the life-giver. She ran her fingers through his dark, matted hair, scratching lightly at his scalp. Silas groaned in his sleep, a low rumble of pleasure. Outside, the storm raged on, burying them deeper, but inside, in the glow of the fire, the line between master and servant, between beast and beauty, had dissolved. There was only the heat, and the two of them, binding themselves together against the dark. The storm broke 2 days later. It didn't taper off, it simply vanished, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. The sun that crested the peaks of Blackwood Mountain was blinding, shattering against the pristine 4-foot drifts of snow and turning the world outside the cabin into a sea of diamonds. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of rendered fat and strong coffee. Elara moved around the kitchen area, her steps lighter than they had been when she arrived. She wore one of Silas's flannel shirts over her dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the tails hanging down to her knees. It was huge on her, but it felt like armor. Silas was sitting up in the bed. He was pale, the dark circles under his eyes standing out like bruises against his skin, but the fever had broken. He was sharpening his knife. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic. He wasn't looking at the blade, though. He was watching her. His gaze followed her every movement, stirring the oats, adding wood to the stove, bringing out a cloth. It wasn't the predatory stare of the auction block. It was the watchful guard of a shepherd. You should eat, Elara said softly, bringing a wooden bowl of porridge to the bedside. You lost weight. Silas snorted, a low rumble in his chest. Hard to keep weight on when the blood boils. He took the bowl, his large hand still trembling slightly, a remnant of the sickness. You stayed awake. 2 nights. Someone had to keep the fire, she replied, a faint blush touching her cheeks as she remembered the way she had clung to him, skin to skin. Silas reached out, his rough fingers brushing her wrist. Elara. The sound of his voice speaking, her name not girl, not woman, but Elara, made her heart stutter. But before she could lean into his touch, a sound from outside shattered the morning peace. It was the high-pitched, terrified scream of the draft horse in the stable. Silas froze. The tenderness vanished instantly, replaced by a tension so sharp it was palpable. His head snapped toward the door. The knife stopped moving. Then came the crunch of snow, not the soft patter of an animal, but the heavy, rhythmic trudge of boots. Many boots. "Get down," Silas growled. The command was low, guttural. He threw the bowl of porridge aside, ignoring the mess, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He swayed, his face going gray with the effort, but he forced himself to stand. "Silas, you can't." Elara started, panic seizing her throat. "Get behind the chimney," he roared, the volume shaking the dust from the rafters. He grabbed the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall. He jacked the lever, chambering around, but before he could raise it, a voice called out from the other side of the heavy timber door. "Mr. Thorne, we know you're in there. We saw the smoke." Elara's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. It was high, reedy, and laced with false bravado. "Jedediah." "Uncle," she whispered, horror dawning. "Open up, Thorne." Another voice shouted rougher, deeper. It sounded like Skinner, a foreman from the mines who had lost 3 fingers in a blasting accident and blamed the world for it. "We know you got the gold. We saw the pouches you dropped. A man don't drop gold like that unless he's sitting on a mountain of it." Silas moved. He didn't walk. He lurched, using the adrenaline to bypass the weakness of his body. He positioned himself between the door and the corner where Elara stood, paralyzed. "Go away," Silas bellowed. "Trespassers get buried." "You're sick, Thorne," Jedediah yelled back. "Town doc saw you riding up, said you look like death warmed over. You ain't in no shape to fight." "And we want the girl back," Skinner shouted. "You stole her. That sale wasn't legal. We're here to rescue her." Laughter followed, cruel and knowing. They didn't wait for a response. A gunshot exploded. The heavy oak bar across the door splintered as a slug tore through the wood near the lock. Then came a heavy impact, a battering ram, likely a log they had cut from the tree line. Boom! The door groaned, dust raining down. Boom! "Behind the chimney!" Silas screamed at Elara, not looking back. He raised the rifle. The door exploded inward. Splinters of oak flew like shrapnel. The cold air rushed in, a blinding white fog carrying the scent of gunpowder and sweat. 3 men surged through the breach. Skinner was in the lead, a massive pickaxe handle in his hand. Behind him was a gaunt miner with a rusted revolver, and skulking in the rear was Jedediah. Silas fired. The miner with the revolver spun around, clutching his shoulder, his scream cut short as he hit the floor. Silas worked the lever clack-clack, but his movements were a fraction too slow, hindered by the fever that still gripped his muscles. Skinner didn't stop. He swung the pickaxe handle with the force of a man used to breaking rock. The wood connected with the barrel of Silas's rifle, knocking it from his weakened grip. Silas didn't retreat. He didn't cower. He roared a sound that was pure, animal fury, and threw himself at Skinner. It was a clash of titans. Silas, even sick, was a force of nature. He slammed into Skinner, driving him back into the wall. Bottles on the shelves shattered, raining glass and pickles onto the floor. Silas's fist, heavy as a sledgehammer, connected with Skinner's jaw with a sickening crack. But the miner was fresh, and Silas was running on fumes. Skinner absorbed the blow and drove a knee into Silas's stomach, right into the infected claw wound. Silas grunted, the air leaving him. He faltered, his legs buckling. "Get him down! Hold him down!" Skinner yelled, spitting blood. The injured miner on the floor scrambled up, ignoring his shoulder, and grabbed Silas's legs. Together, they dragged the giant down. Silas fought like a trapped bear, biting, clawing, thrashing. He got a hand around the miner's throat and squeezed, his eyes rolling back in his head, going feral. Thwack! Skinner brought the pickaxe handle down on the back of Silas's head. Silas collapsed. He didn't go unconscious, but his limbs went limp, his vision swimming. He snarled, trying to push himself up, drool and blood mixing in his beard, but his body refused to obey. "Tie him! Tie the bastard!" Skinner panted, kicking Silas in the ribs. Elara watched from the shadows of the chimney, her hands pressed over her mouth. Her world was ending. The only thing that had ever made her feel safe was bleeding on the floorboards. Jedediah stepped into the room, stepping gingerly over the debris. His eyes darted around greedily, landing on the silver candlesticks, the furs, the quality of the tools. Then he saw Elara. "There you are, girl," he sneered, his fear evaporating now that the monster was down. "Hiding, as usual. Did he hurt you? Don't matter. We got a buyer in the city. A brothel keeper who likes 'em big says there's a market for soft things." He took a step toward her, reaching into his pocket for a length of rope. "Come on now, Elara. Don't make a fuss. You know you ain't got it in you to fight." Elara looked at Silas. The bear was trying to crawl toward her. His eyes were unfocused, swimming with blood, but he was reaching for her. Even broken, he was trying to protect her. "Too fat," they said. "Useless. Burden." Something inside Elara snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a dam breaking. She wasn't a burden. She was abundance. She was weight, and weight was force. Her eyes darted to the stove. The fire she had built that morning was still roaring. On top of the cast-iron range sat the heavy skillet, sizzling with bacon grease. Beside it, the large pot of water she had been boiling to wash the sheets, boiling, scalding hot water mixed with lye soap. "Come on, Ellie," Jedediah cooed, stepping closer. "Be a good girl." Elara stepped out from behind the chimney. She didn't shrink. She didn't hunch. She stood to her full height, expanding her chest. "I am not," she said, her voice steady and cold as the mountain wind, "going back." Jedediah laughed. "And what are you going to do, sit on me?" Elara grabbed the handle of the cast-iron skillet. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the propriety of violence. She swung it with both hands, putting every ounce of her body weight, every pound of her shame and her anger, into the motion. Jedediah saw it coming too late. His eyes widened. Clang! A heavy iron struck the side of his head with the sound of a church bell ringing underwater. Jedediah didn't scream. He simply folded, crumpling to the floor like a sack of wet grain. Skinner turned, his eyes widening. "You stupid sow!" He raised the pickaxe handle and charged at her. Silas roared from the floor, trying to grab Skinner's ankle but missed. Elara didn't back down. She dropped the skillet and grabbed the pot of boiling lye water by its two handles. The metal burned her palms, but she didn't feel it. As Skinner lunged, she heaved the contents of the pot directly into his face. "Ah!" Skinner dropped the club, clawing at his eyes, the scalding water and caustic soap blistering his skin instantly. He shrieked, a high womanish sound stumbling backward, blinded and agonizing. "Get out!" Elara screamed. It was a primal sound, deep and resonant. "Get out!" She grabbed the skillet again. Skinner, blind and thrashing, tripped over Jedediah's unconscious body and fell hard. Elara stood over them, heaving, the skillet raised high. She looked like a Valkyrie, her hair escaping her bun, her face flushed with rage and steam. The third miner, the one with the shot shoulder, looked at his fallen leader, then at the unconscious Jedediah, then at the woman who looked ready to kill them all. He looked at Silas, who was beginning to rise again, shakily, pulling a knife from his boot with murder in his eyes. "To hell with this," the miner yelled. He didn't wait for his friends. He scrambled out the broken door, slipping in the snow, and ran for the horses. Skinner was still screaming, rolling on the floor. Silas dragged himself up. He used the wall for support, his chest heaving. He looked at the carnage. He looked at Elara. He limped over to Skinner. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the screaming man by the collar of his coat and the seat of his pants. With a grunt of exertion that popped fresh blood from his wounds, Silas heaved him toward the open door. He threw him out into the snow. "Take the trash with you!" Silas roared at the fleeing miner. He kicked Jedediah's limp body, rolling him out onto the porch as well. Silas stood in the doorway, the wind whipping his hair, the rifle back in his hands. He fired a shot into the air, the crack echoing off the valley walls. "And don't come back." He watched until the surviving miner managed to drag his companions onto their horses. Jedediah draped like a corpse, Skinner wailing, and disappear down the mountain path. Only then did Silas turn back to the room. The silence returned, but it was ragged now. The cabin was a wreck. The door was shattered. Blood stained the clean floorboards. The smell of burnt gunpowder and lye hung heavy. Elara stood in the center of the kitchen, the skillet still clutched in her hand. Her chest was heaving. Her hands were red and blistering from the pot. She was trembling, the adrenaline beginning to crash. Silas dropped the rifle. He stumbled toward her. He looked terrifying, blood in his beard, a lump rising on his skull, his eyes wild. But when he reached her, he fell to his knees. He didn't bow this time. He collapsed against her, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. "Elara," he sobbed, the sound torn from him. "Elara." Elara dropped the skillet. It clattered to the floor. She sank her hands into his hair, holding his head against her. She wasn't the victim. She wasn't the burden. She was the fortress that held him safe. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, looking at the broken door and the snow beyond. "I've got you." The adrenaline faded as quickly as the winter light, leaving behind a throbbing silence and the sharp chemical sting of lye in the air. The cold wind rushed through the shattered doorframe, carrying snowflakes that hissed as they hit the hot iron stove. Silas remained on his knees, his face pressed against the softness of Elara's midsection, his breathing ragged. But as his senses returned, he stiffened. He pulled back, his eyes darting to Elara's hands. They were red, angry welts rising on her palms, where she had gripped the scalding pot. "Your hands," he rasped, horror filling his voice. He stood up, swaying slightly, ignoring the blood trickling from the gash on his own head. "You burned. For me." "It's nothing," Elara said, though her voice shook. "Just a blister." "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't the bark of a master this time. It was the desperate plea of a man who couldn't bear to see a scratch on a diamond. He guided her to the bed, his movements tender. He went to the cupboard, retrieving a jar of bear grease and a roll of clean linen bandages. He knelt before her, his massive, battered hands trembling as he uncorked the jar. With infinite gentleness, he applied the cool grease to her burns. Elara hissed through her teeth, but the pain was distant. What felt real was the look on his face, pure, unadulterated worship mixed with a crushing guilt. "I brought them here," Silas muttered, wrapping the linen around her fingers. "Wolves follow blood. I am blood." "You didn't bring them," Elara said firmly. "Greed brought them, and envy." Silas finished the bandage and sat back on his heels. He looked around the cabin, the sanctuary he had built to keep the world out, now breached and violated. He looked at the blood on the floorboards. Then he looked at Elara, his expression hardening into a painful resolve. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room, to a loose floorboard beneath the window. He pried it up with his knife. He reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a heavy iron box. He carried it to the bed and set it down. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that shook the frame. Silas opened the lid. Elara gasped. It was filled to the brim with gold nuggets the size of walnuts, vials of dust, and thick stacks of currency. It was more money than the entire town of Oakhaven would see in a century. "Take it," Silas said. His voice was dead, hollow. Elara looked up at him, confused. "What?" "All of it," Silas said, gesturing to the box. "Take the horse." "I will. I will ride with you to the train station in the city. You take this. You go to San Francisco, or east, somewhere with paved streets, somewhere with gentlemen." He turned away, unable to look at her. "You are a queen, Elara. You proved it today. You fought like a lioness. You deserve a castle, not a cave, not a beast who brings madmen to your door." Elara stared at the gold. It glimmered in the firelight, cold and indifferent. It could buy her a mansion. It could buy her silk dresses, servants, a life where no one would dare call her fat, because she would be too rich to mock. She looked at Silas's back. He was hunching again, trying to make himself small, trying to disappear into his own scars. Elara stood up. She walked over to the box. She closed the lid with a sharp snap. Silas flinched. "A gentleman," Elara mused aloud, her voice calm. "You want me to find a gentleman?" "Yes," Silas whispered. "Someone soft, someone kind." "The gentleman in Oakhaven," Elara said, stepping closer to him, "laughed when I was put on a block like cattle. The gentleman bet on my weight. The gentleman called me a sow." She reached out, grabbing Silas's arm and forcing him to turn around. She grabbed his face between her bandaged hands, ignoring the sting. She forced him to look at her. "And then a savage came down the mountain," she said, her eyes fierce. "A savage who paid double. A savage who bowed to me in the mud. A savage who gave me his bed and slept on the floor. A savage who called me abundance." Silas stared at her, his blue eyes wide, shimmering with unshed tears. "Elara, look at me. I am scarred. I am ugly." "You are the only beautiful thing I have ever seen," she interrupted. "You are the mountain, Silas. You are the shelter. And I am not going anywhere." "But the danger—" "Let them come," Elara whispered, leaning her forehead against his chest. "We beat them once. We'll beat them again. I'm not a china doll, Silas. I'm not fragile. I'm heavy. I'm strong. I can hold you." Silas let out a shuddering breath, a sound like a crumbling wall. The resistance drained out of him. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off the floor, burying his face in her neck. "My wife," he groaned into her skin. It wasn't a question. It was a claim. "Your wife," Elara confirmed, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of him, pine, smoke, and safety. 6 months later. Spring arrived late in the high country, but when it came, it struck with a vengeance. The gray slush of winter vanished, replaced by a carpet of wildflowers that painted the alpine meadows in violet and gold. The air was crisp and sweet, filled with the sound of rushing meltwater. Down in Oakhaven, the mud was still thick. The town had shrunk, the mines were failing, and hopelessness hung over the valley like a shroud. People spoke in hushed tones about the upper ridge. They didn't go up there anymore. Not after what happened to Skinner. The story had spread that the bear of Blackwood had found a mate, a woman who was a witch, a giantess who threw boiling lye and wielded iron like a toy. They said they were 2 monsters now guarding the gold, and that the mountain itself fought for them. High above the misery on the porch of the fortress cabin, Elara sat in a rocking chair Silas had carved for her during the long winter nights. It was wide, sturdy, and polished to a shine. She was sewing a new shirt, the fabric stretching over her lap. She looked different. Her skin was rosy from the mountain sun and the wind. She hadn't lost an ounce of weight. In fact, she might have gained some, fed on venison, fresh trout, and the fierce devotion of a man who treated every meal he cooked for her as an offering. She wore a dress of fine blue wool, ordered from a catalog, the color of the mountain sky. The new front door was open, a slab of oak 4 inches thick, reinforced with iron bands. Silas came around the corner of the cabin. He was carrying a fresh stack of firewood, the logs resting easily on his shoulder. His beard was trimmed, though still wild, and the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He dropped the wood by the pile and wiped his hands on his breeches. He walked up the steps, the wood creaking familiarly under his boots. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to Elara. She looked up, smiling a genuine, radiant smile that crinkled her eyes. Silas leaned down. He placed a hand on either arm of the chair, boxing her in, surrounding her. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. It was a slow, deep kiss, unhurried and full of possession. "Hungry?" he asked, pulling back just an inch. "Always," Elara teased, resting her hand on his bearded cheek. Silas chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest. "Good! Caught a turkey. Fat one." He straightened up, looking out over the valley, down toward the tiny, insignificant specks of the town that had rejected her. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his thumb rubbing the fabric of her dress. They didn't need the town. They didn't need the world. They had the mountain. They had the gold buried beneath the floor. And they had the fire that burned between them, a fire that had turned a cold, lonely winter into a lifetime of warmth. The savage and his queen watched the sun dip below the peaks, bathing their kingdom in gold, neither of them alone, neither of them broken, and neither of them ever wanting to be anything else.